Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on 5 stories that connect in ways the mainstream media doesn't want you to see. From youth revolutions in the Himalayas, to Beijing's quiet power play, to the science that exposes what fossil fuels are really doing to our oceans and our future.
I'm Maya Clarity, and tonight's investigation cuts deep. We're looking at how political upheaval, corporate food systems, and climate science are all converging in March 2026. The pattern is unmistakable once you see it: the people demanding change, the powerful adapting to keep control, and the science that makes it all undeniable.
We've got new peer-reviewed research showing that oil slicks on our oceans are actively altering global temperatures. We've got a landmark study on El Niño that should terrify every coastal nation on Earth. And we've got a country of 30 million people who just threw out their government and are now voting for something new.
Plus, a groundbreaking open-source study that finally puts hard consumer data behind the plant-based meat debate, and China revealing its hand at the 2 sessions with a plan that's equal parts climate ambition and geopolitical chess. This is going to be a packed show. Let's get into it.
We start tonight in Kathmandu, where as of today, March 5, 2026, people are casting ballots in what many are calling the most consequential election in Nepal's modern history. This comes just 6 months after youth-led protests successfully toppled the sitting prime minister. Al Jazeera is reporting live from the ground, and the energy is electric.
Let's set the stage here, Alex, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. Nepal has been grappling with a cascading series of crises, many of them climate-driven. This is a country where glacial lake outburst floods have displaced thousands, where the monsoon patterns that agriculture depends on have become dangerously unpredictable, and where a generation of young people watched their leaders do nothing about any of it.
That's exactly right. The youth protests that erupted 6 months ago weren't just about corruption or economic stagnation, though those were certainly factors. These young Nepalis were watching their Himalayan glaciers disappear in real time. Nepal sits at the front line of climate change. The Hindu Kush Himalayan region has lost roughly a third of its ice volume, and the rate of loss has accelerated dramatically in the last decade.
And what makes this story so significant from a climate journalism perspective is who these protesters were. This wasn't a fringe environmental movement. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, this was a broad-based youth uprising: students, young workers, first-time political participants, who were demanding that their government treat the climate crisis as the existential threat it is for a mountainous, landlocked, climate-vulnerable nation.
The fact that they succeeded in toppling a prime minister is extraordinary. Nepal's political establishment has been dominated by the same rotating cast of parties and power brokers for decades. These young people broke through that. And now, today, as they vote, the question is whether the new candidates will actually deliver on climate adaptation, on green infrastructure, on the kind of systemic change these protesters demanded.
Here's what I'm watching closely. Nepal contributes a negligible percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions, yet it bears some of the most devastating consequences. This is the fundamental injustice of the climate crisis, and these young voters understand it viscerally. They're not just voting for a new prime minister. They're voting for whether their country will survive the next 50 years of warming.
And let's be honest about the power dynamics here. Nepal is squeezed between India and China, 2 of the world's largest emitters. Whatever government emerges from today's elections will have to navigate that geopolitical reality while trying to protect its own people from floods, landslides, and agricultural collapse. The youth got their revolution. Now comes the harder part.
The international community should be watching Kathmandu very carefully today. Because if a small, climate-vulnerable nation can channel its citizens' rage into democratic action, into actual electoral change, that's a template. That's a proof of concept for climate-driven political transformation everywhere. The question is whether the rest of the world is paying attention or whether Nepal gets ignored, again, as a footnote.
Now let's pivot to a very different kind of political theater, but one with enormous climate implications. China's annual 2 sessions, the combined meetings of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, are underway right now. And as the South China Morning Post reports, this year's sessions are telling a very different story than the triumphalist narrative Beijing has projected for decades.
That's a critical observation. The framing from Beijing this year isn't about miracle growth. It's about resilience. The South China Morning Post describes it as a transition from high-speed to high-quality growth, and from dependence on external demand to a more resilient, innovation-driven economy. Against the backdrop of global tensions and fragmenting supply chains, China is signaling that it sees opportunity in adversity.
Now, let's decode what that actually means for climate. When Beijing says innovation-driven economy, they're talking in large part about their massive investments in clean energy technology. China now manufactures over 80% of the world's solar panels. They dominate the global electric vehicle market. Their battery technology is years ahead of Western competitors. This isn't just economic policy. It's climate infrastructure at a scale no other nation can match.
But here's where it gets complicated, and where the investigative lens really matters. China is simultaneously the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. They're still building coal plants. Their total carbon emissions haven't peaked yet, despite promises that they would by 2030. So when we hear resilience and high-quality growth, we need to ask, resilient for whom? High quality by what measure?
Exactly. The two sessions are revealing a government that is hedging its bets brilliantly. On one hand, they're positioning to dominate the global green economy, which is projected to be worth tens of trillions of dollars by mid-century. On the other hand, they're not willing to sacrifice short-term industrial output to get there. They want to lead the clean energy future while continuing to burn coal today.
And the geopolitical dimension here is enormous. With global supply chains fragmenting, with the United States imposing tariffs and trade barriers, China's pivot to domestic consumption and self-reliance has major implications for international climate cooperation. If the world's two largest economies are decoupling rather than collaborating on emissions reduction, we are in deep trouble on the climate front.
The South China Morning Post frames this as Beijing recalibrating its development model rather than clinging to the habits of the boom years. That sounds progressive. But recalibration isn't the same as transformation. China's leadership is making calculated moves to ensure their economy thrives in a climate-disrupted world. Whether their actions actually reduce the disruption itself is a very different question.
What I find telling is the emphasis on self-reliance. This is a government that has read the writing on the wall. They know that climate change will disrupt global trade, that extreme weather will shatter supply chains, that resource competition will intensify. Their resilience strategy is fundamentally about making sure China can weather that storm, even if other nations cannot.
And that should concern every developing nation watching. Because if China and the United States are both retreating into economic nationalism on climate, who funds adaptation in the global south? Who helps nations like Nepal, which we just discussed, build the infrastructure to survive what's coming? The two sessions may be China's domestic political event, but its implications are profoundly global.
The bottom line on the two sessions is this: China is positioning itself to profit from the climate transition while delaying the most painful parts of that transition at home. It's a masterclass in strategic ambiguity, and the climate doesn't care about strategy. It only cares about emissions.
Now, let's turn to the science. And our first study is one that should change how we think about what we eat. A new open-source research paper, published on AR14, presents the first comprehensive, large-scale benchmarking of plant-based meats against their animal counterparts. This isn't industry-funded marketing. This is open-source, pure accessible science.
And the framing of this research is important. The authors begin with an undeniable premise: global food production must reduce its environmental impact while meeting rising demand for dietary protein. That's not an opinion. That's a physical constraint. Animal agriculture accounts for roughly 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's the leading driver of deforestation, and it uses approximately 70% of all agricultural land on Earth.
The study acknowledges something the plant-based meat industry has struggled with: consumers continue to prioritize taste and texture over sustainability. This is the core tension. We know the environmental math. We know that shifting even a fraction of global meat consumption to plant-based alternatives would dramatically reduce emissions, land use, and water consumption. But people eat what tastes good.
What makes this study different from previous work is the scale and the methodology. This is systematic, large-scale consumer data, not a focus group of 50 people in a lab. And it's open source, meaning the data and methods are available for anyone to scrutinize, replicate, or build upon. That's a direct challenge to the proprietary research that both the meat industry and the plant-based industry have relied on to make their respective cases.
And the advances in protein structure and flavor chemistry that the researchers document are genuinely significant. The gap between plant-based products and conventional meat has narrowed considerably. But this study doesn't sugarcoat the remaining challenges. There are still meaningful differences in sensory experience, and until those gaps close further, the mass market shift that climate scientists say we need will remain elusive.
Here's the part that the meat industry does not want you to think about. Even with current plant-based products, even with the taste gap that still exists, the environmental math is overwhelming. A kilogram of beef produces roughly 60 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions. A kilogram of plant-based protein? Somewhere between 2 and 6, depending on the product. That's not a marginal improvement. That's an order of magnitude difference.
And the open-source nature of this benchmarking is a direct threat to the corporate playbook. For years, the conventional meat industry has funded its own research, shaped its own narratives, and lobbied aggressively against transparency in food production. An open-source benchmark takes that power away. It lets independent researchers, policymakers, and consumers see the data for themselves, unfiltered by industry spin.
The policy implications are significant. If governments are serious about meeting their climate commitments, food system transformation has to be part of the equation. This research gives policymakers the evidence base to support plant-based alternatives through subsidies, procurement policies, and public education, the same tools that have been used to prop up animal agriculture for decades.
Let's be clear about who benefits from the status quo. The global meat industry is worth over $1 trillion. The 5 largest meat companies on Earth have a combined carbon footprint larger than many nations. They have every incentive to dismiss research like this, and they will. Our job is to make sure the science doesn't get buried.
Now let's turn to a study that connects something most people would never think to connect: the oil slicks floating on our oceans and the temperature of the planet. A new paper on AR14 presents a stochastic dynamic theoretical model that examines how oil slicks on the sea surface affect sea surface temperature, which is one of the most critical indicators of global climate.
Let me set the scene here. Oil slicks are not rare anomalies. They are widely distributed across the world's oceans. They come from shipping accidents, from offshore drilling operations, from routine vessel discharges, and from natural seeps amplified by industrial activity. They are, as this research describes, a form of coverage on the sea surface, a persistent part of the ocean environment that has been largely ignored in climate modeling.
And that's the key insight of this research. We've spent decades building climate models that account for atmospheric carbon dioxide, for ice albedo feedback, for ocean circulation patterns. But this film of petroleum products sitting on the surface of the sea, changing how the ocean absorbs and releases heat? That's been a blind spot. This model attempts to fill that gap, working from the microscale, a single oil slick and its surrounding water, up to global implications.
The mechanism is straightforward but profound. The ocean surface is the planet's primary heat exchange interface. It absorbs solar radiation, it releases heat through evaporation, it drives weather systems. When you put a layer of oil on that surface, you change the physics. You alter the rate of evaporation, you change the albedo, and you modify the thermal dynamics of the water column beneath.
And here's where this becomes a climate story with teeth. Sea surface temperature is not just a number on a chart. SST drives hurricane intensity. It determines rainfall patterns across entire continents. It controls the productivity of fisheries that feed billions of people. If the persistent presence of oil on our oceans is measurably altering SST, then the fossil fuel industry isn't just warming the planet through emissions. It's warming it through spillage.
Think about that for a moment. The oil industry's climate damage isn't limited to the carbon dioxide released when we burn their product. The extraction process itself, the transport, the inevitable spills and leaks, those are directly modifying ocean temperatures. It's a double assault on the climate system. One in the atmosphere, one in the ocean. And until this research, the second assault has been largely invisible.
The model described in the paper is stochastic dynamic, meaning it accounts for the inherent randomness and variability in both oil slick distribution and ocean conditions. This isn't a simplistic calculation. It's an attempt to capture the complex, chaotic reality of how millions of patches of petroleum interact with the largest heat sink on the planet. The implications for existing climate models could be significant.
And let's talk about accountability. If oil slicks are measurably affecting sea surface temperatures, that's another line item on the fossil fuel industry's ledger of climate damage. That has legal implications, regulatory implications, and financial implications. The companies responsible for these slicks, whether through drilling accidents, pipeline leaks, or routine operations, may be contributing to climate change in a way that hasn't been priced into any carbon accounting.
The deeper question this research raises is about what else we're missing. If something as visible and well documented as ocean oil slicks has been overlooked in climate science, what other anthropogenic modifications to Earth's surface are flying under the radar? This study is a reminder that the climate system is more complex than even our best models capture, and that industrial activity disrupts it in ways we're still discovering.
Our final science story tonight may be the most consequential of all. A new paper on AR14 examines the future of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, known as ENSO, under continued greenhouse warming. And the findings should be setting off alarm bells in every capital on the planet. ENSO is not some obscure meteorological phenomenon. It is the single largest mode of interannual climate variability on Earth.
Let's make sure our viewers understand the stakes. ENSO is a fluctuation in sea surface temperature and atmospheric pressure across the equatorial Pacific Ocean, oscillating on a cycle of roughly 2 to 7 years. When it swings to El Niño, the eastern Pacific warms. When it swings to La Niña, it cools. These swings reshape global weather. They determine whether southern Asia gets its monsoon rains, whether the Atlantic hurricane season is active or suppressed, and whether South America experiences drought or floods.
The researchers used what they call a lag linear model to project how ENSO will behave as global temperatures continue to rise. And the title of the paper, The Rise and Fall of ENSO in a Warming World, tells you that the story is not simple. This isn't a straightforward case of El Niño events getting stronger or more frequent. The very character of the oscillation may be changing, and that has cascading implications for every nation that depends on predictable weather patterns.
Predicting and understanding ENSO's response to greenhouse warming is, as the researchers note, essential. And I would go further, it's existential for food security. Globally, ENSO events are correlated with some of the most devastating agricultural disruptions on record. The 1997-98 El Niño caused an estimated $34 billion in damage worldwide. If the oscillation becomes more extreme, more erratic, or shifts to a fundamentally different pattern, the consequences for global food systems are staggering.
What makes this research particularly important is the modeling approach. A lag linear model captures the time-delayed feedbacks that drive ENSO dynamics. The interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere in the tropical Pacific operates on multiple timescales, and small changes in the underlying mean state, the baseline temperature of the Pacific, can push those feedbacks into entirely different regimes. That's what greenhouse warming does. It changes the baseline.
And here's the critical insight that connects this to everything else we've discussed tonight. We're not just adding heat to the climate system uniformly. We're adding it differentially. The poles warm faster than the tropics. Land warms faster than ocean. And within the ocean, the surface warms faster than the deep. Those gradients are what drive the circulation patterns that ENSO depends on. Change the gradients, and you change the oscillation.
The implications for insurance markets, for agricultural planning, for disaster preparedness are enormous. If ENSO becomes less predictable, or if it transitions to a different regime altogether, the seasonal forecasting systems that governments and industries rely on become less reliable. You can't plan for what you can't predict. And right now, this research is telling us that our predictive capacity for the planet's most important climate oscillation may be deteriorating.
Let me put this in human terms. The farmers in Indonesia who depend on ENSO forecasts to know when to plant their rice. The emergency managers in Peru who use ENSO predictions to prepare for flooding. The water authorities in California who plan reservoir operations based on whether an El Niño or La Niña year is coming. All of those decisions depend on ENSO behaving in roughly the way it always has. This research suggests it may not.
And the fossil fuel industry's fingerprints are all over this. Every fraction of a degree of warming that shifts the Pacific's baseline temperature changes the ENSO equation. The companies that have spent decades funding climate denial and lobbying against emissions reductions aren't just responsible for hotter summers and rising seas. They may be destabilizing the fundamental oscillation that governs weather across half the planet.
Now, Alex, let's do what we do best on Truth Report. Let's connect these 5 stories and show our viewers the pattern that emerges when you lay them side by side. Because these aren't isolated events. They are facets of the same global crisis and the same global power struggle.
Start with Nepal. A generation of young people, facing the physical reality of climate change in their mountains, in their rivers, in their fields, rose up and demanded political change. They succeeded. They toppled a government. And today, they're voting. That's the human response to the climate crisis at its most direct and most democratic.
Now contrast that with China. At the 2 sessions, Beijing is managing the climate transition from the top down. No youth revolution needed, because the Chinese Communist Party has decided, strategically, that dominating green technology is in its interest. But the goal isn't to save the planet. The goal is to ensure Chinese resilience in a disrupted world. The people of Nepal fought for change. Beijing is engineering it, on its own terms.
And behind both of those political stories sit the scientific realities we covered. The oil slick research shows us that the fossil fuel industry is damaging the climate in ways beyond even carbon emissions. They're physically altering the ocean surface, changing how the planet's primary heat sink functions. That's not a future risk. That's a present reality, quantifiable and attributable.
The ENSO study takes it further. It shows that the warming we've already locked in is potentially destabilizing the most important climate oscillation on Earth. The weather patterns that billions of people depend on for food, water, and safety are becoming less predictable. And the plant-based meat benchmarking study gives us hard data on one of the most effective tools we have for reducing food system emissions, if we choose to use it.
The pattern is this: the science is clear, the solutions exist, but the political and economic systems that could implement those solutions are either captured by fossil fuel interests, oriented toward national self-interest rather than global cooperation, or dependent on consumer choices that haven't yet shifted at scale. The young people of Nepal understand this. That's why they took to the streets.
What strikes me is the contrast between the urgency of the science and the incrementalism of the politics. We have a study showing oil slicks are altering ocean temperatures. We have a study showing ENSO may be fundamentally changing. We have clear evidence that dietary shifts could slash agricultural emissions. And yet, the political responses, even the most progressive ones, are about resilience and transition rather than the radical, immediate action the science demands.
And let's name the beneficiaries of that gap between science and action. The fossil fuel industry profits from every year of delay. The conventional meat industry profits from every year that consumers don't shift their diets. The geopolitical actors who position themselves as climate leaders while continuing to emit profit from the appearance of action without its substance.
The losers are the people who can least afford it. The young people of Nepal whose glaciers are disappearing. The coastal communities facing intensifying hurricanes as ENSO destabilizes. The farmers in the global south whose growing seasons are becoming unpredictable. The marine ecosystems choking under petroleum films that nobody bothered to model until now.
This is what investigative climate journalism is for. Not to repeat press releases. Not to both sides of physical reality. But to trace the connections between political power, corporate profit, scientific evidence, and human suffering. Tonight's stories, from Kathmandu to Beijing to 3 research labs publishing on AR-14, form a single narrative. The climate crisis is accelerating, the science is getting clearer, and the gap between what we know and what we do is widening.
And that gap isn't an accident. It is maintained, deliberately, by industries that profit from inaction and governments that prioritize short-term stability over long-term survival. Every story we covered tonight, from Nepal's revolution to China's strategic positioning to the research on oil slicks, meat alternatives, and ENSO, confirms that the information is not the problem. The political will is the problem. The corporate capture is the problem.
So here's our call to action tonight. Read the science we cited. The AR-14 papers on oil slicks, ENSO modeling, and plant-based meat benchmarking are open access. Anyone can read them. Share them. Demand that your representatives engage with them. The young people of Nepal didn't wait for permission to demand change. Neither should you.
Follow the 2 sessions coverage carefully. Watch what China actually does, not just what it says. Track whether the resilience rhetoric translates into real emissions reductions or just into better positioning for a disrupted world. The climate doesn't care about political framing. It responds to physics.
And make no mistake, the stories we've covered tonight will be footnotes in 6 months if we let them. The Nepal election results will come and go. The 2 sessions will close. The AR-14 papers will settle into citation databases. But the underlying realities, the melting glaciers, the oil-slicked oceans, the destabilizing oscillations, those don't go away. They compound.
That's why we do this show. That's why Truth Report exists. Because someone has to connect these dots, name these interests, and refuse to let the comfortable narrative stand when the evidence says otherwise. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay critical, and stay engaged. The truth doesn't report itself.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. We'll see you next